before the internet, before reality television, before anyone had ever heard the phrase cancel culture. There was a school on your television screen that felt more real than anything else on children's TV. Grange first aired on the BBC in 1978, and it did something no other kids' program dared to do. It showed bullying without a tidy resolution. It showed friendships that fractured and never quite healed. It showed teenagers who swore under their breath, cut class, fell in love, and sometimes made choices that ruined their lives. Created by Phil Redmond, the man who would go on to build Brookside and Hollyoaks, Grange ran for 3 full decades, from 1978 until 2008. And in that time it turned a rotating cast of ordinary London schoolkids into some of the most recognizable faces in British television history. Nearly 50 years on, we want to know what actually happened to them. Not the rumors, not the recycled clickbait, but the real, documented story of where the cast of Grange Hill is in 2026. Some of them built long, celebrated careers. Some of them walked away from fame entirely and never looked back. And some of them are no longer with us, including one name that made headlines again just months ago, in a story none of us expected to be telling. Let's go through the halls of Grange Hill one more time. We have to start with Susan Tully, because her journey out of Grange Hill became bigger than the show itself. Tully joined the series as a young teenager, playing Suzanne Ross, one of the pupils who helped ground the show's early years in ordinary teenage reality. She stayed with Grange Hill through the early 1980s, before making the leap that would define her career. In 1985, Susan Tully joined EastEnders as Michelle Fowler, a role she played for a decade, through storylines including a teenage pregnancy that became one of the most talked-about plots in British soap history. For most actors, a 10-year run on the nation's biggest soap would be a career in itself. Susan Tully had other plans. She stepped away from acting almost entirely and moved behind the camera, training as a director. It turned out to be one of the smartest career pivots in British television. Her directing credits went on to include some of the biggest dramas the BBC and ITV have produced in the last 2 decades, and she built a reputation as a serious, respected filmmaker rather than a nostalgia act. In 2026, Susan Tully is in her late 50s, and she remains one of the most private former child stars of her generation. She rarely gives interviews about her acting years, preferring to let her work as a director speak for itself. It's a quiet, disciplined kind of longevity, and in an industry that often chews up child actors and spits them out, it's arguably the most successful transformation of anyone on this list. Then there's Michael Sherd, the man who played Mr. Maurice Bronson, and if you grew up watching Grange Hill, just hearing that name probably brings back a small jolt of fear. Bronson was cold, sharp-tongued, and terrifyingly strict, the kind of teacher who could silence a classroom just by walking through the door. Sherd joined the show in 1985, already in his late 40s, and he turned Bronson into one of the most feared authority figures in British children's television. What a lot of younger fans never realized is that Sherd was already a screen veteran with an enormous body of work behind him. He played Admiral Ozzel in The Empire Strikes Back. He appeared as Adolf Hitler across several productions, including Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, and he racked up appearances across multiple eras of Doctor Who spanning more than 2 decades. He worked constantly, but almost always in supporting parts, so audiences recognized his face far more often than they knew his name. Sadly, Michael Sherd's story doesn't have a now chapter. He was diagnosed with cancer in the early 2000s, and despite his declining health, he continued showing up at Star Wars conventions to meet fans who adored him. He died on the 31st of August, 2005, at his home on the Isle of Wight, at the age of 67. 2 decades later, clips of Bronson barking orders down a corridor still circulate constantly online. A small, strange kind of immortality for an actor who spent most of his career in the background of other people's films. Michelle Herbert played Tricia Yates, one of the show's original pupils from the very first series in 1978. A smart, occasionally rebellious teenage girl whose friendships and family life formed some of the earliest storylines on the show. Herbert stayed with the role through the early 1980s and briefly reprised the character in the Grange Hill spin-off Tucker's Luck. After that, she made a decision that very few former child stars make. She left the entertainment industry almost completely. Herbert eventually settled in Dundee, Scotland, where she built a private life away from cameras, away from press, and largely away from public record. In 2026, Michelle Herbert is in her early 60s. Details about her life, since leaving show business, are genuinely scarce, which is unusual in an era where almost everyone's life ends up online somewhere, and that scarcity is really the story itself. Of everyone who ever walked the corridors of Grange, Michelle Herbert may be the cast member who most successfully disappeared from public life on her own terms. Todd Carty is the opposite story entirely, a Grange alumnus who managed to stay in the public eye for nearly 5 decades. He played Peter Tucker Jenkins, the mischievous, rule-breaking heart of the show's earliest years, a character so beloved that the BBC handed him his own spin-off series, Tucker's Luck, which ran for 3 years in the early 1980s. That level of spin-off success for a child actor was almost unheard of at the time. Carty didn't stop there. In 1990, he joined EastEnders as Mark Fowler and stayed with the soap for well over a decade, becoming one of the show's most enduring characters through storylines dealing with illness, family conflict, and personal hardship. After leaving EastEnders, he shifted again, joining the bill as the corrupt police officer Gabriel Kent. He even returned to Grange itself for cameo appearances, once in 2003, and again for the show's very last episode in 2008, bringing Tucker Jenkins back one final time to close out the series he'd helped launch. In recent years, Carty has moved behind the camera as well, working on television production, while occasionally popping up in front of it. In 2026, Todd Carty is in his early 60s, and if you're looking for proof that a Grange kid could build a genuine, decade-spanning career in British television, his resume is probably the strongest argument on this entire list. George Armstrong's story is one of the more quietly emotional ones. He played Alan Humphreys, a steady, dependable pupil who represented the ordinary teenager at the center of the show's earliest years, and he stayed with the role through the first 5 series, before reprising it in Tucker's Luck. Rather than chasing more acting work, Armstrong made an unusual and completely deliberate choice. He moved into the technical side of theater production, eventually working as a technical theater manager at a well-known Academy of Dramatic Arts, helping train the next generation of performers from behind the scenes rather than in front of an audience. It was a quiet, stable career, and by all accounts he was well loved by everyone who worked with him. In his final years, George Armstrong was diagnosed with leukemia, and he fought the illness for a long period while, according to friends and former co-stars, remaining remarkably upbeat. He died on the 11th of July, 2023, at the age of 60. The tributes that followed from his former Grange castmates, including Todd Carty and Erkan Mustafa, described him not just as a talented performer, but as one of the kindest people they'd ever worked with. A reminder that the friendships formed on that show often outlasted the series itself by decades. Terry Supat holds a special place in Grange history because his character, Benny Green, was the very first pupil viewers ever saw when the show premiered in 1978. Talented, likable, and a gifted footballer on screen, Benny became one of the breakout characters of the show's opening years. Supat continued acting after leaving Grange, landing a notable role in the 1989 film The Firm alongside Gary Oldman and later appearing in Channel 4's sitcom Desmond's. But steady acting work became harder to find as the years went on, and like many actors who find fame young, he drifted further from the industry that had once made him a household name. Terry Supat died in May 2015 at his home in Walthamstow, East London. He was 50 years old. His death, quiet and largely unnoticed by the wider public at the time, later prompted an outpouring of tributes from Grange fans who remembered him as the show's very first face. It remains one of the more sobering reminders in this whole story, that being the actor millions of people started watching a television phenomenon which doesn't guarantee the industry remembers you on the way out. Few storylines from British children's television have ever landed with the impact of Zamo Maguire's heroin addiction, played by Lee McDonald. The storyline was so powerful, so unflinching for a kid's show, that it became the centerpiece of the Real World Just Say No anti-drugs campaign, and cast members were flown to the White House to meet First Lady Nancy Reagan. McDonald joined Grange as a young teenager in the early 1980s and became one of its biggest breakout stars almost overnight. But rather than building a long acting career off the back of it, McDonald's passion after leaving the show was boxing, and he pursued it seriously until a serious car accident put an end to those ambitions and left him dealing with the physical and emotional aftermath for years. Instead of chasing acting work, he trained as a locksmith and built a small, steady business for himself in Surrey, a genuinely unusual path for someone who had once been one of the most famous teenagers on British television. He's spoken candidly over the years about the psychological toll the accident took on him. In 2019, he made a surprising return to EastEnders in a guest role, and he still occasionally appears on screen, though most of his time these days goes into his family and his locksmith business rather than show business. In 2026, Lee McDonald is in his late 50s, and his story is one of the more grounded ones on this list. A former icon of children's television who found stability in a job that couldn't be further from a spotlight. Gwyneth Powell was the adult so many of us actually trusted growing up. As headmistress Bridget McCluskey, she held Grange together through chaos, discipline problems, and constant teenage drama, appearing in well over 100 episodes across roughly a decade on the show. Powell had already built a solid career before Grange, and she kept working steadily long after leaving it, taking roles in Heartbeat, Holby City, A Touch of Frost, and finding an entirely new generation of fans through Channel 4's sitcom Man Down, where she played Greg Davies' on-screen mother for several years. She was married to fellow actor Alan Leith for decades, one of the more stable long-term marriages among the show's original cast. In 2022, Powell underwent major surgery connected to a serious health complication, and despite the medical team's efforts, complications developed afterward. She died in a Brighton hospital on the 8th of September, 2022, at the age of 76, with her husband and niece by her side. The tributes that followed came from across the industry, from the BBC to her former Grange co-stars, all remembering her as one of the most beloved authority figures in the history of British children's television. John Alford's story is the one that has changed the most dramatically, and unfortunately not in a good way. He joined Grange Hill in the mid-1980s as a young teenager, playing the confident, mischievous Robbie Wright, and for a while his career trajectory looked as promising as anyone's on this list. In the 1990s, he became a genuine star, playing firefighter Billy Ray in the hugely popular ITV drama London's Burning, and he launched a parallel music career that produced several UK top 30 singles. Then, in 1999, everything collapsed. Alford was convicted of supplying drugs after being caught in a newspaper sting operation, a scandal that got him dropped from London's Burning and effectively ended his mainstream acting career overnight. He spoke openly in later years about struggling with alcohol and the psychological weight of losing his career so suddenly, and he had further brushes with the law in the years that followed. Then, far more seriously, Alford, using his birth name John Shannon, was convicted in September 2025 of multiple counts of sexual activity with a child and sexual assault involving two teenage girls, relating to an incident in Hertfordshire in 2022. He was sentenced in January 2026 to 8.5 years in prison. Just 2 months into that sentence, on the 13th of March, 2026, John Alford was found dead at HMP Boree in Norfolk. His death is under investigation by the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, as a standard procedure for any death in custody. It is an undeniably dark and difficult end to a story that began with one of the most cheerful characters Grange Hill ever produced, and it's a stark reminder that then and now retrospectives don't always end the way anyone would hope. Erkin Mustafa played Roland Browning, one of the most sympathetic characters the show ever created, a kind, intelligent boy who was relentlessly bullied because of his weight, and whose storylines became some of the most emotionally resonant of the entire series. Mustafa played the role for around 6 years, turning what could have been a one-note comic character into one of Grange Hill's most quietly inspirational figures. After leaving the show, he continued working in television, including a stint on Lenny Henry's sitcom Chef, and he stayed visible in British entertainment culture ever since, popping up on programs like Soccer AM and Celebrity Juice, and doing entertainment interviews and media work in more recent years. Unlike some of his former castmates, Mustafa never fully left the industry or the public eye, choosing instead to stay loosely connected to television and media work in whatever form it took. In 2026, he's in his mid-50s, still recognized constantly for a role he played nearly 40 years ago, and by most accounts, still fairly comfortable with that. Alison Bettles brought confidence and attitude to the role of Faye Lucas, one of the standout teenage girls of the early 1980s era, whose friendships and rivalries captured a very specific kind of school life tension. Bettles stepped away from acting through the 1990s, aside from occasional guest appearances, and moved into a quieter life away from the entertainment industry. But unlike some of her former co-stars, she never disappeared completely. In recent years, Bettles has returned to performing, reuniting with several other former Grange Hill actresses for a stage play, sharing stories about the show and reconnecting with an industry she'd mostly left behind decades earlier. She's spoken about the challenges of balancing a private, non-acting career with the occasional pull back toward performing. In 2026, Alison Bettles is in her late 50s, proof that leaving the spotlight doesn't always mean leaving it forever.